There was a few things that I wanted to accomplish with this video. First of all, I wanted to put my preferences and beliefs under scrutiny, specifically regarding caliber and handgun choice. I also wanted to make a list and explanation of the things that I think are basically required to win a gunfight. Shooting fundamentals are a part of that, which is why I discuss grip and stance. So let's start with calibers. For a long time I've been recommending 9mm over other calibers due to my preference. The basic argument for 9mm is less recoil, which results in less time to fire multiple shots, cheaper ammunition, and a bit more capacity than .45 ACP. While there is a difference in recoil between 9mm, 40, and .45, this difference doesn't matter that much for a person who is reasonably skilled. I would also say that a snubby .357 Magnum revolver is plenty controllable as long as it is not unreasonably light. The difference in capacity between 9mm and .45 in full-size handguns isn't that much either. As long as you do your part and you know you can shoot well under stress, the difference of, let's say, 4 rounds really matters little as long as you are putting the rounds where they need to go. It has been demonstrated that regardless of caliber, animals and humans generally need time, usually seconds, to bleed out before they are incapacitated by the damage to their vital organs. So even if you've made good hits, unless they damage the nervous system, your assailant may still be trying to put holes in you, even if he is dead on his feet. Unfortunately, we don't have any useful scientific testing that has shown if particular handgun calibers or bullets consistently kill faster than others. I've shown in previous videos some anecdotal evidence that large calibers like .44 Magnum can kill in roughly the same time as smaller calibers like 9mm. The question always is, what caliber should I use? And the only way we can really have a decent answer for that is by first asking, what are your goals? Let's say you know someone that has a physical limitation like low grip strength. Whether that's because of advanced age, some sort of injury, or a naturally slight build is somewhat irrelevant. The thing that I always hear or read about is that revolvers are easier to use. So if they are easier to use, those with physical limitations would be choosing revolvers over semi-autos. Louise, for example, has back pain and arthritis. She realized that a .38 Special snubby revolver had a long and heavy trigger pull, as well as more recoil than she was comfortable with at the time. A 9mm Glock 19, on the other hand, had an amount of recoil and trigger weight that was much easier to use. She eventually got to the point where she was more capable and more confident in her ability to handle both of these guns, though. Reloading a revolver takes more skill and more dexterity than a pistol. You can only really argue that a revolver has a simpler manual of operations and easier to learn how to use than a pistol. Specifically, you have to teach someone to chamber a round before firing and clear malfunctions with a pistol. I would conclude that revolvers are harder to shoot than semi-autos, and that if you have physical limitations, you are not necessarily forced to use a .22 either, and that people with physical limitations are probably best served with the 9mm. Say you have a friend that works or spends his time in confined spaces. Let's say he drives a bus, and he worries about violent drug addicts or homeless mentally ill people that harass him. As far as I know, there isn't a strict dress code for bus drivers, so he might realize that he can carry a larger handgun in a custom holster in a cargo pants pocket. Since a bus is a fairly enclosed space, firing a handgun inside it would be extremely loud, so he might decide to use a smaller suppressor on a compact .45 loaded with subsonic rounds. .45 makes sense because it's as large as you can get in a semi-auto pistol that you can still also use subsonic ammunition with. Since he knows that someone who is out of their mind on drugs is not likely to show much reaction to being shot, even after their vitals are damaged, he acknowledges that he may have to make pelvis shots to immobilize the threat as well. The larger diameter .45 round does more damage and consequently is somewhat more of an advantage than 9mm. Like I've said before, the recoil of the .45 is basically a non-issue if you are decently skilled. Let's just say that my goal is to make the most amount of damage possible for each round fired, but also that I am limited to semi-auto pistols because I have determined that I need decent capacity for self-defense. Let's also say that I've ruled out things like the Desert Eagle because that's not really a concealable option. To accomplish this goal, I would want to buy a handgun that is either already chambered in .357 SIG or is in a caliber like 40 Smith & Wesson that I can convert to .357 SIG. Then I would have to get the reloading components for .357 SIG and Extreme Defender bullets from Lehigh Ammunition. I've mentioned in other videos that Extreme Defender rounds can do more damage than conventional hollow points, and that the damage they do is proportionally increased by the impact velocity of the bullet. Since hot .357 SIG rounds have considerable velocity, they give pretty impressive damage for a handgun round. So I would likely buy a handgun chambered in 40 Smith & Wesson and convert it to .357 SIG with an aftermarket barrel that has a fully supported chamber because I'd load it with +P+ ammunition. The thing about .357 SIG is that it's not a popular caliber, so I'd end up using 40 Smith & Wesson for training. Since it's so uncommon, I'd be paying a premium for every .357 SIG round, which can be offset by reloading. However, this requires a bit of time and money invested to accomplish this goal. If I could prove that meeting these goals gives significant advantage in an actual gunfight, enough to make a difference, specifically ensuring faster blood loss due to increased damage, I can justify the investment. With such a loud gun, it'd also be a good idea to put a suppressor on it as well. So if I were to harvest X number of animals with a .357 SIG, and compare the time until incapacitation or death with X number of animals I harvested with regular .44 Magnum hollow points, I may find that there is a significant difference between the two, or I might find that there isn't enough of a difference to really matter. However, in a previous video, I showed that both the average self-defense shooting and average police shooting have relatively low rounds fired. So you would be right to ask if my first requirement for more capacity is really a good one. After all, there may be features or qualities that are more important than capacity by itself. For example, revolvers can do things that pistols just can't. Likewise, the .357 Magnum revolver would also be able to get very high velocity and consequently very high damage. Before I talk in depth about revolvers, I want to quickly address the capacity question. If all other advantages are more or less equal in most situations, then it would make sense to choose the weapon with more capacity, even if more capacity is not needed in most situations, especially since a heavy double-action revolver trigger can be a hindrance compared to a lighter striker-fired pistol trigger. So, if you're choosing a revolver over a pistol, you have to have a good reason for doing so. This might be a bit controversial, but I feel that personal preference is not a good enough of a reason by itself to justify using a revolver or a pistol, or vice versa. The handgun is a tool meant for preserving your life. Emotional attachments, personal preference, and caliber requirements based on unproven beliefs or theories should really not be considered, as making faulty assumptions can undermine your chances of survival. I would prefer that every gun comes with the ability to swap or customize grips, but I'm not going to make that a hard requirement for a defensive handgun. If I decided to buy a 1911 just because of all the cool grips that I could put on it, you'd probably think I'm crazy for prioritizing aesthetics over functionality when my life is on the line. Likewise, we have another example here. Some people believe that the vast majority of double-action pistols with double-stack magazines have grips that are too large, and this causes accuracy problems by forcing the user to have an improper grip. If this was true, then every police department that switched to double-action pistols of this sort would realize that their officers can't shoot well anymore, and would probably switch back to the revolvers they used to have. Likewise, if this was true, the Army would have had serious problems getting their soldiers to shoot well with the double-action, single-action Beretta M9. Next, some people wonder if the high-capacity magazine was intended to be an actual tactical advantage, or if it was merely added to compensate for a weapon that is hard to shoot well. Depending on how you define high-capacity magazine, we may get different answers. In my opinion, it was probably the C96 that had the first true high-capacity magazine, even if it was an internal magazine and not a detachable one. In that case, it was clearly because of a desire to have more capacity in a gunfight, and clearly not a crutch needed to make up for a gun that's hard to shoot. We know this because the 10-round and 20-round higher capacity versions were just variations on the same design. Ultimately, the 20-round version was really not that popular, seemingly due to the greater difficulty and time it took to reload because of the increased magazine spring pressure. So questioning the merit of high-capacity magazines and the need for double-stack magazines can put you at a disadvantage. This is especially true if you hold the belief that you only need 6 rounds to solve the problem. Some people genuinely hold the belief that if you can't solve a problem with 6 rounds, then having more ammunition simply can't help you solve the problem unless in exceptional circumstances. Of course, there is nothing special about having 6 rounds. They are simply taking the capacity of most revolvers and making an arbitrary and useless rule based off that number. These sort of people then give very unhelpful advice, like if you've shot your 6 rounds and you are still in danger, just take cover and wait for the commotion to attract some help. People like this don't understand the purpose of the defensive handgun. If help was already nearby, then the average citizen wouldn't ever need a handgun. If we apply the 6 rounds are all I need logic anywhere else, we get humorous situations. Is your 6-foot garden hose not long enough to water your plants? Then you should really sit down and wait for someone with a longer garden hose to show up. Now for the steelman argument against more capacity. The argument being that if 2 rounds to the assailant's chest are not enough, you should make a headshot instead. Likewise, situations that require you to put a few rounds in 5 or 6 assailants are very rare. This person then goes on to say that most encounters happen at close range, and if you make good hits with the handgun, then the chances are that you'll likely handle the situation without needing to change magazines. Next, he concludes that large-bore handguns are better because they have a greater chance of damaging a critical organ and they damage more tissue. He states that if you believe a smaller caliber is better than a larger one, or if they are equal, then your assumptions contradict the facts. First of all, if you believe having 12 or more rounds is excessive, then you better have a good explanation why gunslingers and soldiers would burden themselves with 2 or more 6 guns instead of just 1. Second of all, there is indisputable evidence that more handgun rounds fired into the body leads to more organs being damaged and failing, resulting in a higher fatality rate. Fatality, of course, is 100% incapacitation. I'm not suggesting fatality is the goal of every self-defense shooting, but rather with firearms, the same things that increase your ability to incapacitate will also increase fatality. Third of all, there are likely situations that can significantly decrease your accuracy. For example, you may have received a concussion and brain damage from an angry assailant. Likewise, you may have your arms or hands cut and your ability to control recoil has been severed along with some of your tendons. Another example would be if you are struggling and trying to make good hits on an assailant who is both stronger than you and trying to disarm you. Obviously, high stress also degrades accuracy, so it's entirely possible that you are not used to high stress enough to consistently make good hits. His point about larger calibers being better, though, is pretty much indisputable, though it's difficult to quantify the advantage that an increased likelihood of hitting vital organs gives. I would also add that this was written before the extreme defender rounds were invented, and now high-velocity rounds, even if they have a small diameter, have the ability to do significantly increased damage. So we should only be making decisions based on what we know to be true and choosing the handgun that has the most advantages possible within the practical limitations we have. So if you look at the evidence we have, and you might decide that revolver cartridges like .357 Magnum or semi-auto cartridges like 10mm both have been proven to be plenty effective. So we'd need a specific reason to choose the .357 Magnum over the 10mm. A good reason could be that you already have a .357 Magnum and you are already familiar and skilled with it, so carrying a 10mm that you are not familiar with may put you at a disadvantage. Just to be clear, I'm using 357 Magnum and 10mm as examples. I'm not saying that 10mm is the only suitable semi-auto cartridge. In fact, in another video, I proved that specific kinds of modern 40 Smith & Wesson ammunition can meet or exceed the original hot 10mm Norma round in terms of cubic inches of damage. There are a few reasons why you might choose to have a revolver then. Probably the best reason is the fact that a revolver does not need you to have a proper grip on it like a semi-auto would for you to cycle the action reliably. This is useful in the situation that you have to fire blindly over your shoulder at an assailant who is strangling you from behind. There are two more minor reasons that revolvers could be a good choice. The first being that revolvers don't have slides that will get jammed out of battery when pressed directly against an adversary. The problem can be fixed on pistols by simply putting a flashlight on it that extends past the muzzle. The second reason being that a semi-auto pistol with the magazine release on the left side has a very high likelihood of having the magazine release button accidentally pressed if you are fighting with an assailant on the ground with the pistol in your left pocket. The same is probably true with revolvers with button cylinder releases. Some solutions to this problem would be to either carry the pistol in another pocket or buy a pistol that has a reversible magazine release. So the minor reasons are just that, minor. And to me, the possibility of having to shoot over your shoulder and behind you is the only valid reason that you would decide to carry a revolver today. That is, aside from the obvious reason that you are already skilled and familiar with a revolver that you own. Since events where you are forced to shoot over your shoulder are pretty rare, it doesn't make much sense for me to accept the limited capacity of the revolver and the heavier double action trigger solely for a rare event. If you really think about it, if you have someone behind choking you out, what's to stop them from using their superior position to wrestle your gun away as soon as you pull it out? That would be the smart thing to do, wouldn't it? This argument about firing over your shoulder maybe makes more sense if you are being mauled by a bear or some other wild animal, but that would probably be a different conversation. Since I'm talking about revolvers, I want to make a couple of basic guidelines. First of all, very small and lightweight revolvers, like those with titanium frames for example, directly undermine your ability to shoot well and quickly. It is self-defeating, in my opinion, to choose a very light gun with a heavy recoiling caliber like 357 Magnum. It would make much more sense to carry a light gun if it was chambered in a caliber like 38 Special that has very low recoil. I also think it's quite unwise to carry a 5-shot snubby as a primary weapon because they are harder to shoot and because officers who have shootouts with 5-shot revolvers tend to upgrade afterwards. Finally, I see no reason to go lower than 38 Special in caliber.